You're listening to the UnSafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
This is the way the Jews thought at that time. Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, he went into the wilderness to show, for that time period, it was a reflection of the 40 years that the nation spent in the wilderness. But he was there to take back from the enemy what it is that the enemy had taken back in Genesis chapter 3. And his victory over Satan in the wilderness, on Satan's turf, was a victory over Satan and the gods of the nations.
There are many different prophecies regarding Babylon all throughout the Bible. Most scholars hold the futurist interpretation of Revelation, which sees Babylon the Great as an evil world system based in Babylon, possibly signifying Rome, and controlled by the Antichrist during the last days before Jesus' return. As Pastor Ken continues his teaching series, he'll be encouraging you to study the Word daily and keep your eyes fixed on Jesus regardless of what's happening in the world. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Isaiah chapter 13 as he continues his message, Prophecies Against Babylon.
There is a spiritual aspect to this fall as well as the physical aspect to the fall. And that's what chapter 13 verses 21 and 22 are about. To unpack a little bit of this, we also have to understand something called cosmic geography. And that's the understanding that the Jews of the time would have had of their understanding of what took place in Genesis chapter 11 and how the nations were subdivided. And you have ungodly nations with different gods overseeing them. And then you have Israel, which is ruled by Yahweh. So remember, when the nations sinned and rebelled at Babel, they were given instructions, specifically by Yahweh, to fill the earth, to multiply and fill the earth, not to multiply and fill the plains of Shinar, which is where they all were. But the instructions are in Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. Very, very clear. There's also another issue that took place at Babel. They were trying to recreate conditions that existed in Genesis chapter 6 that were the cause for the flood in the first place. So let's go to Genesis chapter 10 and take a look at verses 8 through 11. There we have a description of some of the different nations, but it talks about Cush. Cush fathered Nimrod. Now, Nimrod's going to be the ruler of Babel when everything happens. He was the first to be a giant. This is what it says in the Septuagint. The first to be a giant upon the earth. The Hebrew is Gibor. But you can see what the Jews thought about it when they translated it. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, which we'll see that phrase before the Lord means in rebellion to the Lord. Because of this, they will say, as Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord, and the beginning of his kingdom became Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. By the way, the ziggurat of Babel is not in Babylon. Okay, so let's forget that for now. From the land he went out to Assyria and built Nineveh and the city of Rehoboth and Calah. So that's what it says in Genesis 10. The Septuagint considered Nimrod to be a giant. And it says before Yahweh, which tradition says is in opposition against God. The Hebrew shows Nimrod to be a Gibor, a mighty one, which was translated by the rabbis to Gigos, giant. So is there something going on with Nimrod? Did he find something? Did he do something to himself physically? We don't know. But those are interesting terms that are being used. In Genesis 11:4, when the rebellion takes place, it says, then they said, come, let us build a city and tower with its top in the heavens so that we make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered across the face of the earth. And again, in Genesis 6, we see mighty men who want to make a name for themselves. They were giants wanting to make a Shem or a name. We have the same thing happening here, the same picture. They were trying to replicate what was going on back in Genesis 6. So here, and we also see that there's a reference in this rebellion in Genesis 11 to the divine council, just as there was in the beginnings of the book of Genesis. In verse 5 to 7, it says this: the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, behold, they're one people. They all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand one another's speech. There's no royal we in Hebrew. This is not the Trinity, which is what I got taught in Bible school. This is the divine council. That's who God is talking to. And they go down and they confuse the languages. So at Babel, the nations of the world all had one language. They directly disobeyed God, and they all went into a single city. A key expression that shows up here 5 times is all the earth in this section of Scripture. The entire human race is determined to be sinful because they're not doing what God wanted them to do. They're still out of harmony with God's will, even though the flood had already taken place. They want to approach God on their terms. They want to replicate the conditions that existed in Genesis chapter 6. They thought that was where wisdom was coming from. Well, that's not exactly where wisdom was coming from, because these were fallen angels that came down to Mount Hermon, and they corrupted the planet. And God, to the point that God had to flood the planet to start with 8 people in a barge. But the function of what they were building in this ziggurat is agreed to was they were trying to symbolize a mountain. And in that area, a sacred mountain played an important role in most of the religions in that area. Rooted in the earth, its head lost in the clouds, it was a meeting place, a point in heaven where they would meet with the gods, the divine activity. On its heights, the gods were imagined to have their abode. So what they were trying to do is they were trying to replicate what originally took place back in Genesis 6. And you can see the Genesis, the beginnings of that particular viewpoint, that they were on this mountain. Now, Yahweh, when in Genesis 11, he disinherited all those nations. We find that referenced in Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9. But he disinherits the nations. And we see in Genesis chapter 10, there's 70 different peoples. So we have 70 different nations, 70 different language groups, and they all spread out across the planet at that point. It was at that point, after that happened, that Yahweh then meets with a guy in Ur of the Chaldees by the name of Abram. And he begins the process of redemption by picking out a people for himself, the Jews. And this process that he begins ultimately results in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the beginning of the reconciliation of all those nations that he divorced back in Genesis chapter 11. But the process of reconciliation begins on the day of Pentecost when the disciples all speak in different languages. And you start comparing the languages with the people groups that were in Genesis 10, and you start finding it amazing that there is a close similarity. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9, it says this: when the Most High distributed nations as he scattered the sons of Adam. So in other words, 70 nations, they're all set out. He set the boundaries for those nations, the geographical boundaries, according to the number of the angels of God. And his people, Jacob, became the portion of the Lord, Israel an allotment for his inheritance. So we don't know if it's one fallen angel. Well, they're not fallen at this point. They're followers of Yahweh. They're part of the divine council. We don't know if it's one or a group. We don't know. But they're subdivided out, and it's based on the number of the members of his council at that point. And whatever took place, the establishment of these boundaries resulted in a world that was subdivided physically and geographically and cosmically. So the way a Jew would understand is they would understand that there is a place where this nation, Greece, is going to be. And they also, by the way, have their own administrator, their own divine being that's supposed to be overseeing them, who's probably corrupted and demanding worship. And by the time you get to where we are in Isaiah, they're talking about all these false gods. And Israel has reached the point, and Judah has reached the point where they're doing what they're not supposed to be doing. They're actually worshiping these gods of these other nations. It's not God, it's not that God's territory. It's Yahweh's territory, and they're inviting in these false gods, which is anathema based on what they should be doing and what they should not be doing. They're not supposed to do that, but they were. Israel, according to Dr. Heiser, was holy ground. It was Yahweh's inheritance. That's what he had set up. The language of Deuteronomy 32:8-9 makes that clear. The territory of the other nations belonged to those other Elohim, those other divine beings, those angels, those servants of Yahweh who were part of the divine council. And we see in Psalm 82 that they became corrupt. We don't know how, we don't know when, but they became corrupt. And we don't know the specifics, we just know that they were. So it's this understanding of cosmic geography that we see in the last two verses of chapter 13. It makes the verses dealing with the fall of Babylon a lot more expansive. Yeah, we see the dealings with the city of Babylon by the Medes and the Persians. Yeah, they dealt with it. But we also see the dealings with the city of Babylon, the city that we see in the book of Revelation, the final Babylon, being dealt with physically, but we also see being dealt with spiritually. And those spiritual powers who were behind it, the princes and principalities and all these things that you see Paul referencing in the New Testament, plus the princes that you see referenced in Daniel chapter 10, they're all part and parcel of what is being punished or shown being in what's left of Babylon at the end of the age in verses 21 and 22. The idea of cosmic geography is that ground that did not belong to Yahweh belonged to the gods of the other nations. This is what a Jew would think. It's also reflected in the book of Exodus, and the camp of Israel for the Jew was holy ground. That's what they felt it was. The tabernacle was at the center of that camp, and in the center of the tabernacle, where the Holy of Holies was the visible presence of Yahweh in a cloud by day and a fire by night. So that was a given. Again, ground not occupied by the presence of God, whether that meant the Israelite camp during the journey to Canaan or the temple in Jerusalem, was not holy ground. So you have the Holy of Holies. And if you recall from the law, anyone who went into that area without having all the appropriate ceremonies done is toast. And we see that happen several times, sometimes even good intentions, where we see we see the Ark of the Covenant being moved after being taken by the Philistines, and somebody reaches over and touches the Ark, and he's gone immediately. That's holy ground. That's holy. That's a holy area. He's not supposed to touch it. God's glory is here, but not there. God's glory is in the center of the camp, but not outside the camp. One must maintain separation from those areas. So just like one in the tabernacle must maintain separation from the Holy of Holies, or in the temple, one must maintain separation from the holy place, the Holy of Holies. As we studied the law, we saw that. There are forbidding uninhabitable places in the lands. They're all associated with the other gods. And they're unholy in the sense of sinister and evil, but the Jew would think that the desert wilderness, whether literal or metaphorically, they would look at that and see that it was evil and sinister as well. They would say, "Oh, this is a bad place." Now, I'm not saying that Arizona, Nevada, and the California high deserts are bad or anything like that. This is the way the Jews thought at that time. Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, he went into the wilderness to show, for that time period, it was a reflection of the 40 years that the nation spent in the wilderness. But he was there to take back from the enemy what it is that the enemy had taken back in Genesis chapter 3. And his victory over Satan in the wilderness, on Satan's turf, was a victory over Satan and the gods of the nations. But notice it was on his turf, which means it's now God's turf. God did that intentionally because God's the one in control of that territory, not the enemy. Mark chapter 1, verses 10 to 13 says, "And as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens splitting apart and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, 'You are my dear one, my dear son. In you I take great delight.' The Spirit immediately drove him into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, enduring temptations from Satan." It wasn't just at the end, it was the entire time. "And he was with wild animals, and angels were ministering to his needs." Now, the wilderness or the desert is a place that the Jew would connect as part of the realm of the dead. I mean, they believe that Satan was part and parcel of that. It belonged to the enemy. And they believed that it was inhabited by the fallen, by these fallen divine beings, by demons. What's being related by the prophet is that the final destruction of Babylon not only has a physical impact on the physical residents, but it also has an impact on the spirit beings, the demons and the fallen angels who are operating in and around Babylon at the end of the age. And remember, they're limited to planet Earth as a result of what takes place in Revelation chapter 12. So we have no idea how many are actually involved in the city at the end of the age. But it's those in the unseen realm is what's being dealt with. Now, the idea of cosmic geography is used to relate that it's not something that belongs to Yahweh, but it's the dwelling place of the unclean. So that's what's being shown here. Now, was this an issue for the Jews in the past? Oh, yeah. If you take a look at Leviticus chapter 17, specifically verses 3 to 7, you'll see that there are laws that are promulgated there specific to sacrifices, and the sacrifices were supposed to be taken to the tabernacle, because the people at that time, as it says in verse 7, were offering their sacrifices to goat demons. They were to no longer offer their sacrifices outside of the camp to goat demons, the wilderness, acting like prostitutes by going after them. So there was already a problem in the camp, even as they were going along with the visible presence of God in the cloud by day and the fire by night, but they were still sacrificing to goat demons outside of the camp. They weren't supposed to do that. But the word for goat demons there is a word that we see also here in Isaiah chapter 13, verses 21 and 22. The word for goat demon is the word sarim, and it just means a type of demon, the hairy one, a goat, a buck demon, or a satyr, okay? So fast forward again back to Isaiah chapter 13, verse 21, and we see the word shaggy goats in the New American Standard. Well, that's that same Hebrew word, sarim, from Leviticus 17:7. And there are some other words that are there too that are translated one way, but we have to take a look and see what they really mean. Desert creatures, Saim, that actually means a collective designation for desert creatures with partly demonic features. Oh, so we're not talking about real desert creatures. There's owls, okay, that shows up. That's the word ayim, and it means a howling desert animal or a howler, usually an eagle owl. But it's interesting to note in the scriptures that yelling or howling or yelling out is what the demons did when Jesus cast them out for the most part. They would yell out and then leave. Interesting, I think. Ostriches, that's another word that shows up, and it's actually the word ya'anah. Yeah, it does mean ostrich, but it also means wailing, loneliness, or desolation, or dwelling among the ruins and living in the desert. Where is it that the one who was called Legion, that Jesus went specifically to set free from over 2,000 demons, where was it that he was living? He was in the tombs in the wilderness. Interesting, I think, when you look at that. The animals and the creatures that are enumerated in the oracles against Babylon in Isaiah 13, now they show up again in Jeremiah 50, and we're going to see them in Isaiah 34 as well as we move forward. It is a world that's hostile to human beings. It's one that is designed to destroy man. It's where these demons live. This is what the Jew of that day would see that area as. It's just an evil area. In all three passages where Saim shows together with Yana and Ayim, you see the same mix of different types of demonic activity, the mixed creatures, and they're difficult to really pin down as animals you have to start looking at the spiritual aspect of it as well. And remember that the Bible is a supernatural book. And at times it does speak about that area, that specific area. So let's take a look at it again. Verse 21 and 22. But desert creatures will lie down there. Well, we know they're not desert creatures. And their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches will also live there, and shaggy goats will frolic there. Hyenas will howl in their fortified towers, and jackals in their luxurious palaces. Her fateful time also will soon come, and her days will not be prolonged. The idea that's being communicated to us here by Isaiah is that the final fall of Babylon is going to result that the only inhabitants of that area will be demonic creatures howling and wailing amongst the fallen divine beings who are also howling and wailing. It's a picture consistent with one drawn by Jesus as the final dwelling place of the wicked. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 40 to 42, he says this, "As the weeds are collected and burned with fire, so it'll be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they'll gather from his kingdom everything that causes sin as well as all lawbreakers." And this is global, people and divine beings and demons. "They will throw them into the fiery furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So you wonder because the Jews had a specific viewpoint that there were specific areas that belonged to evil ones, and that's all that was theirs. So we get this picture showing up again in Revelation, specifically where we see that there is an angel that releases a bunch of demons from a portal located at the Euphrates River, and Babylon is at the Euphrates River. It makes you wonder, are we talking about the same place? It's kind of an interesting set of ideas to take a look at. But in verse 22, we see hyenas and jackals referenced, and they're not exactly hyenas and jackals either. They're howlers. And in fact, again, we're seeing this picture that they're being placed into an area of punishment, and they're howling and screaming because of where they are. And it's not a good place. It's a bad place. It gives us a complete picture of the end of Babylon physically, which we've seen. We've seen physically in the near term at the hands of the Medes and the Persians, physically in the late term, yet to come, and spiritually in the late term, yet to come. We see both of those showing up here in Isaiah chapter 13. Now, again, let me just reemphasize this. Biblical writers weren't saying that these animals are demons. They're not reflecting superstition. This was their worldview. They kind of saw the world that way. And the vocabulary of nocturnal presence and behavior, according to Dr. Heiser, allowed the prophets to communicate the notion that some places are the jurisdiction of cosmic evil and are thereby occupied by evil spirits. I don't know if you've ever gone and traveled to areas that are occupied by cosmic evil, but take it from me, I've traveled to different places and even here in this country, and there are some areas where you get this dark feeling of foreboding when you enter. And like you're someplace where you don't belong, that this belongs to the enemy. It doesn't belong to the Lord. And of course, greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world, and we're called specifically to go to those places to bring the gospel and to bring the word of the Lord to them.
It's true that some of us are introverts and some of us are extroverts. But did you know Jesus designed us to function best when we're part of a community? We all have God-given gifts and abilities that, when used rightly and in conjunction with others, the effect for the kingdom of God will be profound. It will reach many who are lost and hurting. So, listeners, if you don't have a community that you belong to, won't you consider getting connected with ours? Or at least learning what we believe and why? The UnsafeBible.com has all that information, and we'd encourage you to read what's written there and then spend some time in prayer. The Unsafe Bible is a radio ministry based out of Jupiter, Florida. And we're so glad that you've paused long enough to listen to today's message from Pastor Ken. If you like what you heard today, and we've piqued your curiosity, why don't you satisfy it by checking out all the other messages we have for you? Go to the unsafebible.com and click on the Media tab. That's the direct link to our archive. We trust that what you find there will challenge and grow your faith. While you're there, be sure to check out the other ways to stay connected with what's happening here at Calvary Chapel, Martin County. Would you rather enjoy connecting through social media? You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Pick your favorite platform, or utilize all three. We trust that today's message from Isaiah spoke to your heart and challenged the parts of you that aren't looking like Jesus. Thanks for listening to the UnSafe Bible.